So we have a very special guest speaker today, Ali Hearn, who is a technical assistant with Midwest PBIS. She is a licensed social worker by trade, clinical social worker, and she is a national presenter, coach, expert in the things that we want to learn about. So we're so fortunate to have her here today to share her knowledge and help us pave a new pathway forward. So welcome, Ali.
Thanks. Hello. Good morning. Sounds very loud to me. How's everyone? Good. It's an honor to be here, so thank you so much for having me. Can we get this turned down a little bit? Sound? Down? Yeah. All right. I'm actually going to get us started real deep, real quick into this. We're going to get going with an activity right off the bat. So here's what I want you to do. In groups of about 5 or 6 right around you, 5 or 6, you got to have kind of a decent sized group, 5, 6, 7. I want you to take a couple of minutes and figure out what is the most unique thing that you all have in common that you didn't know before coming here today. This is, well, I should say, there may or may not be a reward or acknowledgement at the end of this activity for whoever we vote on, right? We're going to vote as a group. You're looking for the most unique thing that you all have in common that you didn't know before today. You got to be in groups of 5 or 6. Turn to the people behind you. Let's have at it. Okay, so how did that go? It looks like you were having a lot of fun. Good? All right, we're looking for the most unique thing you could come up with that you all have in common that you didn't know before today. All right? Let's quickly run through this and find a few so that we can find our folks to acknowledge. What do we got? Some confident folks over here.
The 5 of us all have parents that are still very 40 plus years.
Hey, yeah, congratulations. Wow. 40, we live in a society where we clap when we've been married for a long time. I know. It's a big accomplishment. That's great. And you have a lot of folks in there. 5 of you. Yeah, great. Is it a group of 7? Oh, I was going to say, we're cheating right out of the gates, which is rough. Okay. All right, who else we got? I was going to come with a mic, but maybe you don't need it. We don't need a mic? Okay. You have all fallen in school. Is it this group here? These are our physically challenged group. Great. Does the age range from like elementary through, tell me it's like through college? Oh, that's even better, as adults. Oh, amazing. Yeah, at work. Okay. Oh, I'm so sorry. If everyone was okay, though, falling stories are so great. So good. Okay, good. That's a good one. I like that. Yes, real loud for us.
We have all done 2 unique things.
Ooh, you're my group who found more than one.
Yeah, we really followed directions.
Okay.
We
High
all
achievers.
have gotten a speeding ticket, and we've all hiked a mountain of some sort.
Well, you guys are like rugged. The rugged group. We hike mountains and we get speeding tickets. That's great. And you got 2, which counts for a lot. I like it. You're all like, my dream's to live in Colorado. You're kind of like my edgy crew. Yeah. All right, let's listen up to our friends. Yes, let's go here and then here.
All 8 of us have been to the Caribbean.
All 8 of you have been to the Caribbean. Well done. Well done. We'll leave it there. Yes. They've all skipped school and have had toilet paper on the bottom of their shoes. Was that at the same time? That would have been so impressive. That would have been really impressive. I have found that it's usually the risque ones that end up winning. We had the whole group had somebody slept with somebody from Mexico. We had a whole group do that. All slept with people in unique places. We've had some fun stuff. So we get the skinny dippers here. Thank you for playing. You actually do get a prize. I never have prizes, but you get one.
Look at you guys coming here.
Yay, great job. It did pay off. Skinny dipping was worth it. Little did you know that skinny dipping was going to be like the best thing you ever did, because now you got some chocolates. All right, so thanks for taking a couple minutes to do that. I love doing this activity. People have a lot of fun doing it, and it shows you how easy it is to connect with other people. As we keep talking about relationships in schools, it's amazing to me that this is a topic that as educators we keep focusing on, because you would think it comes so naturally, but it doesn't actually happen everywhere. And it's so important. So when we start to talk about strengthening relationships, sometimes folks say, well, I don't know how to do it. It could be so hard. Where do we start? You just turned to a neighbor and learned more than you have from before today. And by doing things like that, you start to make more connections. Relationships matter. They're really important in our schools, between staff to each other, staff to kids, kids to kids. And we haven't been giving it quite the amount of focus that I think that we need to. So I'm really glad that it's a topic that we're continuing to revisit. And those relationships are so important. Hopefully we all kind of got into this gig for the same reason. So hopefully we are all still wanting the same things for our youth. So let's take a quick look at this video.
Look, I can be a shark. Now my whole house is great. I can do anything good. I like my school. I like anything. I like my dad. I like my cousins. I like my aunts. I like my Allisons. I like my moms. I like my sisters. I like my dad. I like my hair. I like my haircuts. I like my pajamas. I like my stuff. I like my rooms. I like my whole house. My whole house is great. I can do anything good. Yeah. I can do anything good. Better than anyone. Better than anyone.
I love. I've been showing this video forever. I love this video because I'm hoping that's what you want for our kids. That they're happy, that they're excited, that they're self-confident, that they are ready to go out into the world and be excited and contribute, right? And be healthy and competent. And I was showing this video since before I had kids, and now that I have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, I look at this video and I'm like, and dear God, be safe, because I'm so scared you're gonna fall off that counter, right? So it is also very important, right, that our kids are safe and happy and healthy. And I think we got into this, at least I did, to even be able to impact at least one, right? So I was a school-based social worker before coming to do this work. So I was working in schools, and I got into that work with this feeling of, if I can impact even one, then I've done my job, right? Then and you always hope for that one, and I can name those couple that I had over the years that truly made the whole thing worthwhile. You know you had that impact. So there's this great story, the starfish story, and some of you may have heard of it before, especially in education. A lot of folks have heard it. I'm going to do a quick recap on it to make sure we're all on the same page about this story. So there was a girl who was walking down the beach, and a man sees her walking down the beach, and he sees that she's throwing something into the water. So he walks closer to see what she's doing, and she's throwing starfish into the water. And he says, what are you doing? And she says, I'm saving the starfish. And he says, well, look at all these starfish. How are you going to get to them all? She says, if I don't reach each starfish, they're not going to survive. They can't be beached up on the shore. And he says, but there's so many. How are you going to get to them? How are you going to make a difference? You can't possibly make a difference for all of them. And she picks one up, and she says, but I can make a difference to this one, and she throws it back in the water. It's such a sweet story, isn't it? I love that story. And have you ever seen what a beach looks like with starfish up on the shore? I hadn't ever seen one, really, when I looked it up to find out about this story. What? That is insane. So it makes me think a couple things about this story. First of all, girl is way too calm to be walking down the beach like, I'm just going to save this one. Like, that's nuts, right? The second thing is that I think that is a much better representation of what it actually feels like to try to reach all the kids in our schools. I can tell you as a social worker with hundreds of kids in my buildings that I worked in, that's much more of what it felt like. But the last thing is I think the guy in the story had a pretty good point. If we're going to go and try to reach the all, it's not going to work if we go one at a time. We have to start getting better about how we reach all our kids, both academically and socially and emotionally, behaviorally. And I believe we have a moral and ethical obligation to do that. We have an obligation to reach every single kid. So my passion and commitment to this work now is to try to help us do that. So we have a better way to do it than going one at a time. And what is that way? Bum, 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 bum. You have to at least have a triangle in each presentation, and I get mine out of the way early. So this is how we do it. So the way we get there is with MTSS, with multiple tiers of support, both academically and behaviorally, socially and emotionally. Multiple tiers of support, meeting the needs of all kids, right? It's such a beautiful system. It allows us to meet all kids' needs. It's not just a one-stop shop. We're going to do this one thing and call it a day. If it's not enough, we're going to do more. We're going to do other things. So the goal here, if you want to talk about MTSS, it's about a better way to reach all kids. That is what this work is about. It makes it more effective and more efficient to reach the all. The problem is there's a lot of misconceptions about this work. And for the next little bit, when I say this work, I'm talking about MTSS on the behavior side. Okay, MTSS for behavior. Another name for that is PBIS. Okay, so some people get confused with all the acronyms. MTSS for behavior, we're talking PBIS. So misconceptions of this work. Here's the problem. Here's why I'm going across the country trying to straighten up some of these messages, right? A lot of folks, people who are kind of anti the work sometimes, they'll tell you it's because this is what it is, right? Here's some other things that they'll tell you. It's about parties and assemblies and ice cream socials, right? We don't want to have that. We don't want to be in this business for that. Even though other schools get so good at doing tickets and parties, they are crushing with celebrations, and then they think that's all it is, right? It's a lot more than that. It's about rewarding youth for doing things that they should already be doing, that they should already know how to do. Why should we reward them or acknowledge them for such small things? Did it feel good to you to get a box of candy today? Yeah, it feels great. Everybody likes a little extra something, right? But there's a misconception around the acknowledgments. Enabling our youth. I hear this a lot. We sort of let our youth get away with things. I also hear that people think that PBIS is like talking in a higher voice and being nicer, right? So some people are like, I don't like that work because I don't want to be nice. But it's not really about that. It's some people who say, I'm doing the work now, I'm really giving it my all. They just sort of talk higher and talk nicer. Like, stop doing that, Bobby. Instead of knock it off, Bobby, they're like, please knock it off, Bobby. Right? And a little bit higher, a little nicer. Like, I'm fine, I'm trying PBIS. I'm trying to give it a go. Childish, that's a big one that we get. Just because it's simple and basic in nature, behavior science is basic. So just because it's basic doesn't mean that it's childish. I worked in a high school. My most recent experience in schools was in a high school, and kids loved it. As soon as you start to say that you can make the teaching lessons, right, and get high school kids involved with videos, as soon as you say you can earn a free ticket to prom, free tickets to the football games, you just have to make it appropriate and a contextual fit for the people you're working with. I could give you guys some pretty sweet acknowledgments when you come in the door in the morning, getting to school on time. I don't know what it is in your district, wearing jeans or getting someone to cover your class period or just giving you money. I probably could change your behavior a little bit with some of those things. But again, that's only one piece, right? It really has to do with the teaching. Mascots on steroids, right? We get tigers and panthers and bears, oh my. This is what we sometimes think it is. It's just that it gets in the way of what the work really is about. And that it's only for naughty kids. So I get this a lot where people say, we don't have those kids in our building. And I love that because it's like, which kids and what are we talking about? We are no longer in the place where this work, having multiple tiers of support around behavior, that it's just for kids who do more externalizing characteristics, kids who get in fights and throw things and talk back to teachers. This work is also very much for kids who do internalizing things. Kids who have suicidal ideation, they suffer with anxiety and depression, they sit alone on the playground, sit alone at lunch, hide out in the bathrooms. So this work is not just for one certain kind of kid or one certain kind of adult, for what it's worth. And one of the biggest things I hear around the challenges is that this is another thing that we're adding to my plate. So I get my teachers, who I love and adore, who say, I just can't take one more thing on my plate, it's just too much. And what I want to help us to understand is that this work is not meant to be another thing on the plate. This work is the plate. It is the plate. It's an organizational structure. It's a framework that allows you to make decisions using data. It's a way of thinking, it's a way of working, it's a way to change the culture in your building. So when I say it's a plate, I want you to think different plate. I want you to think a better plate. You all have Planet boxes out here? Anybody know Planet Box? Some, yeah, some. This is there was like a wave of educators who were getting into Planet Box. But I'm thinking part of the reason that folks have missed the boat on Planet Box is because they're really expensive and none of us make enough money to actually get them. But they're cool, so check them out, and there's some good knockoffs on Amazon. So check out this plate though. What a great plate. Look at how organized it is. It's more effective, it's more efficient, it's better for the earth, better for humans, all the starfish, amazing. That's PBIS. There it is, that's what it is, right? That's what we're going for. So it's a plate that allows you to organize things in a better way where you can more easily reach all the kids and all the adults. So what is this work really? When you're talking about MTSS for behavior or you're talking about PBIS, what is it really? I want to make sure today that by the time I leave, we're not describing it as tickets and acknowledgments and celebrations, but that we really understand what it is. So it's these three things that are so critical: data and practices and systems. Real quick and brief, what do I mean by each of those? When we use data, it changes everything. We don't want to be using subjectivity to make decisions around what we do for kids. And I think we've gotten better at not doing that necessarily all the time around academics, because there's numbers and cut points. But it's a little more challenging on the behavior side to force ourselves to use data. And I've sat in the rooms, I've sat in problem-solving team meetings, we use a lot of subjectivity. What do you think we should do? I don't know. This worked for his sister. Let's try it for her. His mom's been calling a lot. Let's just go ahead and give it. We do this kind of stuff, and what can happen is, here's a broad stroke, but what can happen is disproportionality. So all of a sudden, and this is happening across our country, little black boys get kicked out or sent out or put somewhere else, and little white boys get higher levels of support. These are the kinds of trends that are happening across our country, and one of the biggest reasons, I think, why we don't want to use subjectivity for our decision making, but we want to use data. It's so, so important, and I want you to create a culture of data where when somebody comes to you and says, the kids are causing total chaos in the lunchroom, that you very quickly are able to say, how many kids? Is it 2 kids or is it 100 kids? What grade level is it? Is it our freshman class? Is it our 7th graders? Let's get more specific about what we're talking about. Always trying to use data. None of our teachers are filling out check in, check out data trackers. Was it none of the teachers, or is it Mr. Smith during 7th period? Because we can work with that. And if it's none of the teachers, we have a naughty adult problem, right? All right, practices. What do I mean by practices? These are the interventions themselves, right? We need a continuum of practices. That's what makes this system so beautiful, is that there's a continuum. It can't be we're going to do this one thing for these kids, and if that doesn't work, then we're done. And it can't just be that we're going to have check in, check out, and then call it a day. There's got to be a whole continuum of things that we offer kids, because as you know, our kids come with a lot of different needs. It's not just one need that all of our kids come in with. But the other thing is, and we know they need to be evidence-based, right? The other thing is they've got to be done with fidelity. And that F word gets overused. I like F words, but this is a really important one. This one's critical. We have got to do the intervention as it's intended to be done. So one of the problems we're having everywhere, I shouldn't say everywhere, right? Let's get specific. In states like Illinois and New York, what we might have going on is that we send kids up the triangle without checking to make sure that we were doing what we said we would do down below. So for example, in some schools, I'm using check in, check out. We're hopefully familiar with that, kind of your first line of defense of what you go to after tier 1. So schools will say, it's not working for this kid. We're going to push them up. We're going to start to put them in a group. We're going to start to do an FBA and create a behavior intervention plan. But we should have parents all over us saying, before you send my kid up the triangle, show me that you were doing the intervention as it was intended to be done down below. As a parent with kids who are starting school, God bless the teachers that will come for the years with me working with them, right? Somebody who's, I know, I don't know if I'm more fearful for them or for me through this process, but very quickly I will come to them and say, I'll do anything for my kid. If he needs more support, let's do it. But before you give that support, show me that you are doing check and check out with fidelity. If we are not doing things with fidelity, we should not be pushing the kids up the triangle. We should be working on the adults to make sure that we're doing it right. On the academic side, that's real obvious. Like, let's give this kid read 180. Oh, well, we weren't doing it right. Obviously, the kid's not going to respond. But when it comes to the behavior side, we don't always check those things. So we really need to make sure that we're checking. And then for the systems piece, this is about getting all our adults on the same page. This is getting our ducks in a row. Getting our adults more consistent with the ways that we're interacting with kids. So if I were to ask you in your building, what kinds of behaviors do you handle in the classroom, and what kinds of behaviors do you send to the office? How similar or different are you from the rest of your staff? It can be pretty confusing for kids in our schools when we're very inconsistent with what we're doing, and we want to make sure our adults are getting on the same page with systems. How are we communicating with home? How are we tracking data? We want to be more similar than different, and the systems pieces are all about getting us on the same page, which is harder than the kids. I used to work in a gen ed setting, work with special ed and gen ed, but then I went to self-contained, and I've now decided the only kind of behavior that is more challenging than a self-contained classroom is adults. So good luck to all of us. So when people say, I don't agree with PBIS, I don't believe in it, it's not really my gig, what they're really saying to me is, I don't really believe in using data for decision making, I'd rather just sort of throw a dart. And I don't believe in having a continuum of supports. I feel like we should just do one thing, and if that doesn't work, too bad for the kid. And we don't need to track data because we can just assume we're doing it right. And why would we get our adults all on the same page? That's just crazy talk, right? So for me, that's where how it sounds to me, and this is what the work is really about. So make sure as you're having conversations in your buildings, let's just kind of try to get on the same page about what the work really is, so we can be talking about the same thing. As students' social emotional needs increase, their behavioral needs increase, we are then going to provide more support. That's the whole gig here with MTSS. As their needs increase, we are going to give them more. But that hasn't always been the belief system of folks in schools. It has often been, let's take away, right? The worse they get, the more the behaviors show, let's take things away. Even in some of our homes, this is how we do it. You know, the parents are like, I've taken everything away, I took the door off the hinges. But instead of taking away, it's a model of giving. And if you need to be convinced on why we should do that, take a look at this. Put some kids in their most vulnerable states and see what happens, right? Are they looking for more or less supports? These are pictures from a haunted house, a hidden camera in a haunted house. It's amazing, right? As your needs increase, you literally hang on to those around you. You're looking for more supports and not less. Okay. So the first big point here, it is more than being positive. Okay? There's so much more to this than being positive, and it's such a beautiful thing that can be so powerful when it's done right. All right. The next piece, let's take a look at this video. And we'll talk about this. So I love this video. It's not that often that we talk about both the challenges for our adults as well as for our kids. So again, bringing back the reality that we are all real in our buildings, that we need to be connecting to each other. But how about the question at the end of this? Would it change how our folks respond to our youth if we knew what was going on for them? What do you think? Yeah? Yeah, I think it does. I think it does change how we respond to our kids. And so my question is, why wait until we find out what's going on for every single kid before we just change the environment to make it more likely that they will respond and be supported and succeed? Do we need to know in order to set up our environment to be that way? So when we talk about trauma, I know we've done a lot of talk out in this area about trauma. You've got some great folks supporting the work out here. One way to talk about trauma is with this terminology about big T and little t. So big T trauma, these are going to be more catastrophic events. Major things that might go on that everybody would kind of sort of agree are traumatic. So the family where the house burns down, and we all know about it, right? Or a death or a shooting, or these big incidents where everybody would agree that's traumatic. We often talk about it in the school and then say, what are we going to do for this family? The less talked about kind of trauma is what we would consider prolonged stress in like family kinds of situations. Big T trauma, if you were to look at the line in a kid's life, you'd be looking at this line going and you'd see this huge spike when the incident happened, and then, lower line again and maybe some other little ones. With the little t trauma, you're looking at this ongoing spiking that happens consistently. So this may be from having an alcoholic parent in the home, or an adult who struggles with mental health, or a situation where you're constantly not knowing when your next meal is coming or how your family's going to get money, this constant anxiety, right? The cortisol that's always pumping for you. So whatever you call this, call it traumatic stress, call it toxic stress, call it adverse experiences. There's lots of different language around trauma. But I think it's important to note that there are these big T events and there's also little t, and I don't think we talk enough in our schools about the little t. I think that goes kind of unnoticed and often slips through the cracks. The kids who experience that slip through the cracks. So of course we have this great study that's been done. How many folks have heard of the ACEs study? All right, good. About 22% of the room has heard about this study. So a couple of points. So for those who've already heard it, you may know these points. And for others, it's really important to at least grab a couple points here. So I'm just going to name a few. So first of all, they call this one of the biggest public health studies that you've never heard of. That's how I felt about it when I heard it. How have I not heard about this, and how are we not talking more about it? In this study, there were over 17,000 people, which is a massive study, right? For a public health study, this was a big one. What they did was they took a look at different kinds of traumatic events. And they're looking at what they call ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. So they're looking at 10 different adverse childhood experiences, and they're asking folks which of these, how many of these they've experienced. So we're talking about abuse, which is broken down into physical, emotional, and sexual. We're talking about neglect, which is broken down to physical and emotional. And then we're looking at household dysfunction, which is going to take a look at mental illness, mother being treated violently, divorce, substance abuse, and a family member being incarcerated. So they asked all these people who were part of the study how many of these things had happened to them at a younger age, between the time they were born and 18. We're looking for up to 18. What they found was that 1 in 6 people who were part of this study reported having 4 or more ACEs. 1 in 6 people, you can assume, 4 or more ACEs. So if my numbers are right for this group, that's about 25 of you who would have 4 or more of those ACEs. So it's tricky when you start to talk about trauma. It can trigger our own things. So hopefully this is brief enough today that we're not going to be triggering ourselves. But it is good to know that adults are coming into our buildings having experienced ACEs as well as our kids. So now you've got adults who may be impacted in different ways and might need to regulate themselves, and then you also have kids who need regulation. It can start to be a complex picture in the schools. So what did they find here? one thing before we move on, people often say, yeah, but who was this study done with? So it's interesting to note that the majority of the people who were part of this study were college-educated, middle class, mostly Caucasian. All right, so what did they find? The number one indicator from the study, the reason the study became such a big deal, is that they found that the more ACEs you have, as your ACEs increase, so does your risk for negative health outcomes and all kinds of negative health outcomes later in life. So it's not just during the time frame when it happened, it's later in life, the impact. And we're talking about categories such as smoking, alcoholism, depression, obesity, heart disease, stroke, STDs, missing work. So many different categories, they're finding the impact later on in life from these adverse childhood experiences from when we're younger. So what I care about today, in addition to talking about the adults, what I really want to focus on is the kids, right? So how does this impact our kids? There's so much data to tell us how it impacts the kids in our schools. But just one indicator, let's just take one graph to look at. The more ACEs you have, the greater the likelihood of grade repetition. Direct correlation, right? It's a direct correlation. So here are some other points to note. Kids who are 3 to 5 who have 2 or more ACEs are over 4 times more likely to have these things: trouble calming themselves down, being easily distracted, hard time making and keeping friends. 3 or more ACEs, kids are 2.5 times more likely to fail a grade. And students with 3 or more ACEs are more likely to be unable to perform at grade level, receive special ed services, be suspended, get suspelled, drop out of school. Not suspelled, expelled. So there's serious impact. These are real numbers. And I think these numbers are changing all the time the more that we're learning. But it's significant. It's important for us to know it's significant. So what would you see as you start to look at learning being impacted? What kinds of ways are we seeing learning being impacted for our kids in our classrooms? These are some of the things that you might see. Challenges with attending to the classroom instructions, with regulating their emotions, with being able to engage in the curriculum, understanding cause and effect. So it's really important that we are aware of this study, that we're aware of what it found, that we're aware of how kids are being impacted in our classrooms. So how many kids are we talking about? How many kids in your classrooms can you assume are being impacted by 3 or more adverse childhood experiences, those items from the list? How many kids can you assume in your classrooms 3 or more adverse childhood experiences? 13 out of 30. That's the number that we're at. Almost half your class, you have to assume, are coming in with 3 or more ACEs. So are we treating this in the same way that we do with other things in terms of professional development for our staff? How many of you have learned how to use EpiPens as part of your training? How many of you have learned how to deal with seizures or something like that as part of our training, right? But are we doing training about trauma at the most basic level for everybody to be aware of this and giving some tools to our classroom teachers and other educators in the building so that they can be prepared? All right, so let's raise our awareness, right? Let's get educated about what's going on with trauma for our kids coming into school, because it's impacting them, which means it's impacting us, and it's impacting us, which means it's impacting them. All right, so are kids being naughty when we see the behaviors, or is it a stress response? Okay, what's going on for our kids? So let's talk about the brain for a second. This is a fun part because if you don't know, I am not a neuroscientist. And so talking about things like science and the brain can be really challenging for that half of my brain. But I'm going to try to break this down in a way that it totally made sense to me. I'm not going to use scientific terminology necessarily, so bear with me. But I like to try to bring messages down to the basic level where everybody can digest them. Okay, so let's talk about this for a minute. It's really important to talk about the brain when you're talking about trauma, because there's physical things that happen to our body that we need to be aware of. And it helps to get a visual. So all of you have a brain right on your hand here. You may or may not have known that coming in today. So if you put your thumb in the middle of your hand and you bend your fingers over it, you've now got a brain. Yeah, so feel free to do it. This is going to be for our demonstration. This is your brain. If you want to learn more about it in this way, Daniel Siegel's the one who helped us to understand about this. And of course, Bruce Perry is like one of the leaders of the work, right? So check those guys out online. But this is my version of it, okay? So you have your brain right here. The brain's broken down. This is the only time I'm going to use the terminology. It's broken down into 3 basic chunks. You like that? Chunks. So you have the bottom part of the brain, which is the reptilian brain. That's the stem part. That's where the spinal cord is. That's the bottom part. That's your wrist and palm. Then you have the middle part of the brain, which is the limbic system, and that's going to be represented by your thumb. And then you have this top part of the brain, which is the neocortex, and this is the wrinkly part where you usually see pictures of the brain. That's what it looks like. This is the piece on the top where we're going to talk about a lot of the cognition and the thinking happens. So let's talk about what goes on in each of these parts, because when our brains develop, they develop from the bottom up. Everybody's brain develops from the bottom up. In the stem part, this bottom wrist part, this is where we develop the instinctive things that we don't think about. They're natural. They are the fight, fight, or freeze kind of things that go on. So this is your heart pounding, your eyes blinking, sweating, the things that happen to your body that you're not controlling. That's all the stuff that develops first in the bottom part of the brain, right? So in this reptilian part of the brain, those are all the instinctive, natural, you don't think about things that happen in your body. The next part of the brain in the middle, that's where we start to get some of that social, emotional stuff going on. That's where we start to be able to feel and have emotional connection to things going on. And the last part of the brain is the piece that goes over the top. And that's where you're sucking in all the knowledge, where you're thinking, where your cognition is, where you're able to rationalize, make rational decisions, right? So my 2-year-old at home, if you watch a 2-year-old, anybody who you love or a little one that you know, their brains are just sucking in information all the time. That's the blue part going on. She's growing this amazing, beautiful, wrinkly blue part on the top of her brain. So when you look at typical development, the reason it's this triangle that goes the way it does is that you see that when they're in the survival skills that they're learning down here, the things that the natural, instinctive things that their body's learning how to do, the brain doesn't have to spend a lot of time down there doing it because kids are in a safe, secure environment. So their body doesn't need to keep spending time learning how to do those survival things because they don't need it in the same way. And then the brain moves on and starts to get into the emotional stuff and starts to get into a little bit of the regulation. And then we quickly move to the cognition piece at the top, where that executive functioning is, and in the front of the brain really allows you to regulate. And they're able to spend the bulk of the time in that place, growing this executive functioning stuff, this stuff that lets us think through our actions, the stuff that lets our brains really grow and be able to do more and more in school, right? So then I want to talk about kids' brains who are coming from adverse childhood experiences. For these kids, it's almost an upside down phenomena that happens. So the brain still develops from the bottom to the top. But in the bottom part, where you get that survival mode stuff, the instinctive things, the things that happen without you thinking, the heart racing, the eyes fluttering, the body has to spend more time there because those kids are constantly in that state of fight, flight, or freeze. Or they've had a traumatic incident that's made it so they need to spend more time there. So then they move on and they get to the middle of the brain and they start to develop that piece, and then they move on to cognition. The pieces all still happen, but they're constantly having to go back to that survival mode place. And sometimes kids' brains will even overdevelop down there. Physically, if you look at 2 different brains, one from typical development and one from development of a kid who's experienced adverse childhood experiences, the brains will actually physically look different because the body is having to spend so much time down here. The cortisol is overloading the system, starting to get into terminology and things that are beyond me. But that's the general idea here, right? So the second one, you can almost think of it like the old records with the grooves in them. There's a really deep groove from trauma. There's a deep groove to the survival mode place, the stuff that happens without us thinking, the fight, flight, or freeze. So it's so often that the needle goes to that deep groove because the child's so used to having to be in that place. And the brain doesn't have a lot of time or energy for the top part, which is the cognition. And then we put them in our schools and we say, well, you need to just tap into that cognition place. Too bad. I know it's not that big for you or you have that much access to it, but you got to do a math test now. And they just can't do it. So one of the ways you can talk about it, even with kids, that I love this terminology, is that their lid is flipped. So during a time where a kid gets triggered, their lid gets flipped and they can't access the regulation and the cognition. They literally can't get to it. They're stuck down here. Sometimes they call it upstairs, downstairs brain. The kid is stuck in downstairs brain. There's like a baby gate up and they can't get past it. So what we need to do for our kids is lower the top of the brain, lower the lid, put the lid down, and now they can access that cognition again. And the thing that's going to do that is regulatory activities, things that regulate them, and other strategies we can talk about. But want you to understand the visual and even help kids. You can even teach kids to be able to say, my lid is flipped. And then we can work with them to help them put their lid down. So a real neat thing to understand the basics, real 101 basics of the brain, and that there's actual impact for kids who are coming in from trauma. So some people see bears in a forest, right? And they get triggered by that. I did Outward Bound in Montana, and I had to do a 24-hour solo where you're by yourself in the woods. I was much younger then. I would never probably do that now. I like to believe I would. I'll tell you I would. I would still do it today. But of course, a bear came over to my site. So I'm by myself in the woods, and there's a bear who's over at my site. For me, as for many people, that is going to trip the trigger for me to send me into fight, flight, or freeze. So you are naturally going to fight, pull out some big knife that I didn't have, and try to fight this bear. You are going to run like heck out of there, or you're going to freeze, and then wonder later why you didn't maybe pick one of the other two. But it's not an option. It's not an option where you get to sit and say, which of these am I going to be? A fight, a flight, or a freeze? It just happens naturally. Some bears are in forests for us, but for our youth who've experienced significant trauma, anything can look like a bear. So you have a touch of a hand of a teacher on their shoulder, bear. You have a raised voice in the classroom, bear. You have a last-minute change in routine, schedule changes, bear. Loud noise, bear. So we may not know what their bear looks like or when they saw a bear, but we can remember that if they've seen a bear before, their wiring may be set up for them to see bears again everywhere or anywhere. So take a look at what fight, flight, or freeze could look like in the classroom. What kinds of behaviors could you see in the classroom that would look like the fight, flight, or freeze response? Anybody seeing these kinds of things in your classroom? I got a real eager participant there. Thank you. You were like, yes, I am. And the challenge here is that you're not going to go up to a kid and say, how many aces you got? Have you experienced trauma? It's not a matter of figuring out if they have or haven't, or figuring out what their trauma was. That's not up to us. Trauma is in the eye of the person who experienced it, right? They're the ones who get to decide if it's trauma or not. But it's not up to us to figure that out. I want you to be aware of what it could look like in the classroom. And where I'm coming from today is saying, why not just set up your classroom and change your behaviors to just make it more likely that the kids won't need to do these things. And that takes a real ability to reflect. It takes a real ability to reflect, because you may be doing things that you don't realize are triggering a student. And that is not for us to shame you or blame you or make you feel bad, but we're asking that you get reflective on some of the things that are going on in your classroom. So let's start seeing bears, okay? Let's look around and start seeing what things are triggering our kids and be aware of those triggers to see if there's things we can do about it. The best way to meet the needs of students with ACEs is through relationships and community. And caring relationships and safe and supportive environments help prevent and mitigate the consequences of ACEs. What's pretty great about that is that we know a thing or two about environments and about relationships, okay? So the truth is, this work is not about changing kids. If we haven't learned that or figured that out already, we're missing the boat here. This work is about changing the environment to make it more likely that kids are going to respond and be successful, both academically and socially and emotionally. So that means changing adult behavior. And that can be really, really, really challenging. If I would have asked you all to move your seats to actually sit up here with me this morning, you would have been so mad. You would have been so mad, because adults do not like to change behavior. We don't. That's why I love working with you. So we need to create an environment that's going to increase the likelihood that kids are going to be successful, right? And especially kids coming in from trauma, they are going to need an environment that is extremely consistent, that is very predictable, and that is incredibly safe for them. We owe it to our kids to set up this kind of environment. And when you create an environment that meets the needs of the kids with the highest level needs, you're creating an environment that benefits all. So what do I mean by that? Real quick, what do I mean by changing the environment? Well, first we're going to set up these expectations that are really, really clear. In your buildings, you're going to be making you already have, I'm sure, your 3 to 5 expectations that are sort of overarching for your building. Often you have a motto that goes with it: live the Raider way, live the Matea life. These kinds of things are really great for our kids to give them, and for our adults, to give them some spirit and enthusiasm behind the way we want them to live their lives in our schools, right? We're going to teach to those expectations. We're going to make sure that kids know exactly what we're talking about. What does that look like? For my 5-year-old at home, me saying we are kind in our home is not enough. I need to teach him what kind means in his bedroom playing with his sister, in his sister's bedroom playing with him, in the bathtub what is kind, in the kitchen what is kind, on the sidewalk what's kind. You almost want to gouge your eyes a little sometimes. They need to know it everywhere. We can't just assume. And same thing goes for adults. If I invited you over to my house today, you might have some questions. Well, there'd be a lot of questions about that. But you might have questions about what's expected, what should I bring, what kind of attire is it? We always want to know expectations. So we need to be laying those out for our kids and making it really clear. We're also going to teach them skills that are going to help the kids who need it to change those inappropriate coping skills that they've developed. And we're also going to do really good classroom practices in our rooms, which is going to help with behaviors as well. Evidence-based, research-based classroom practices. Then we're going to acknowledge the youth when they're doing the things that we want them to do. And this is really tricky. This is where we get hung up on tickets and parties and all kinds of bonkers things, right? There's actually purpose and method behind the madness of acknowledgments. We use them to reinforce behavior, to try and change behavior, to make it more likely that behaviors will occur again. But the other thing that's amazing about acknowledgments is that they strengthen relationships. If you know John Gottman's work, I find his work fascinating, that he looks at what's the strongest indicator of a strong relationship. He can predict relationships that are going to last long term. Because what's the number one indicator? The ratio of positive feedback to negative feedback. It's amazing. And his magic number is 5 to 1. We talk about 4 to 1 in the schools, so we'll give you a little leeway. He says 5 to 1 is what we're looking for. And do you know how hard that is? When we go in classrooms and count, you think you're doing it, but you're not all doing that. Actually giving kids 5 to 1. I do it real good at home, but I do it with each of my kids differently. So on certain days, my son will get he'll get my 4s, and then my daughter gets the 1, and then my son gets he's 5 and she's 2. He'll get the 4s, and then she gets the 1. It depends on the day, right, how we do it. It can't be that way. It's one kid. One kid gets the 4 to 1. You can't take all of your 1s out on one kid and then give the 4s to the other, okay? It's got to be the same kid. You don't think that's funny, 5 and 2? Come on. All right, then we're going to prevent and respond to the problem behavior. Creating consistency about what you do when there's problem behavior is just as important to kids as you creating consistency about the expectations on the upfront. The more clear I get with my kids at home about where the rules are, the better they feel. I actually decided once to go off the work that we say, and I was role-playing with my son, some new rules we had made in the home. He loved it so much that he wanted to keep doing role-playing. And I couldn't believe, like it was a game, like it was fun, he wanted to keep doing it. And you could see in his eyes that he kept feeling safer the more he knew where the boundaries were. Kids want to know what is going to happen if I butt up against those boundaries. So it's just as important that we get consistent about how we respond to problem behavior as how we set the classroom up ahead of time. And the more you can go towards restorative practices, restorative work, where you're strengthening, repairing relationships and community, the better it's going to be. And the last piece is the data-driven decision-making we do. We're going to include lots of different kinds of data. You cannot just use office discipline referrals. You've got to be looking at things that would identify kids with internalizing challenges as well. Nurses' office visits, attendance issues, hospitalizations. You're going to use those as data indicators as well. All right, these are the components of Tier 1. That's how you do it. So a little bit of the why behind that, right? Why we do these things. There's reasons for it, and you got to have all those pieces if you're doing this work. So you can't just hang out at acknowledgments and think that you're doing MTSS for behavior. So these are the classroom practices. Teachers will think that we're doing these practices. Specific feedback to kids. When I say specific feedback to acknowledge a kid, I'm saying you don't just say, great job. You say, thank you so much, Jessica, I don't know what your name is, Jessica, for coming into class on time, which looks like 2 feet in the door when the bell rings. I appreciate you being responsible in my class. That is how we do specific feedback. Knock it off, Bobby. I've told you 10 times. Knock off what? If you say, when I start the lesson, I want eyes on me. Just now you were talking to a neighbor. Next time, let's try and keep eyes on me. That's how we're being responsible. That is feedback. That's an evidence-based intervention right there. So it's really important, these classroom practices. Hopefully you'll keep revisiting these to make sure we're doing these with fidelity in our classroom. Our teachers, we want the toolbox to be filled. I work with teachers constantly that are like, what other strategies do you have? What other ideas do you have for me to use in my classroom? It's not that we don't want these things. It's often, I feel, that we're in an environment now where we're not exactly encouraged to ask all the time because of everything that's gone on with evaluation. But if I sit with a teacher one-on-one and say, hey, do you want some extra skills in your toolbox? Some tools in your toolbox that'll help you around behavior? They're like, yes, and yes, and yes. So we need to create a space where teachers can feel safe and comfortable asking for it. Hey, I don't think I'm doing my 4-to-1s. Can you come in my classroom and count? Can you come watch me? Can you actually model it? Because I don't even know what it looks like. It's okay to ask those things, and we want to get our staffs to a place where you all feel comfortable saying you need it and then that we can provide it to you. If we're not giving you these skills and these tools for the proactive things you can do in your classroom, it often turns into reactive, and we're looking at what we do in response to the problem behavior. And sometimes those practices look a little bit gnarly in the classroom. And our reactions to student behavior is so important because they affect the relationships that we have with our youth. So think about this, over 3 million suspensions a year. 3 million suspensions a year. And the receipt of even one suspension is associated with higher likelihood of academic failure, school dropout, and involvement in the juvenile justice system. We know that, and yet we're giving 3 million a year to our kids. We have to think differently about it, right? And some of you may have practices like these in your classrooms. I won't make you raise your hands. And there's no shame or blame here. But somehow we got into this epidemic of the clip chart. And I feel in a really okay place to talk about it because I worked in a self-contained classroom where I designed my own color system. And I felt so great telling kids, you're bumped down to the next level. You do as good as you could do till you know better, and then you do better. It's important for us to be aware of these kinds of practices. I would ask you 2 questions about the practices in your classroom. The first one is, does the practice ultimately change the behavior? So I'll talk with some teachers who say, yes, my clip chart absolutely does. And I'll say, great, how do you know? And they're like, it feels better in the classroom. Usually, folks who use things like clip charts are not keeping data on it. So I would want to see the data to tell me that the behaviors are actually changing. The second thing you have to ask is, does this practice help or harm our relationship? And I don't think I gave enough credit to how much it was harming my relationship with some of these students. The other thing that's really important is that practices of this nature work for about 80% of your class. They're the kids where they don't need to get bumped more than once, and they're going to change it. That's not what this system is developed for. Teachers are using this for the top 20% of the kids who need so much more than that. But that's why those top 20 are the ones who keep getting bumped. So a practice like this doesn't even work for the kids that we need it to work for. And the public shaming that comes from practices like this are devastating to our kids. If you look at some of Tompkins' work and Nathanson's work in restorative practices and the restorative work, the theory of affect, what happens from shame is devastating for our kids. The compass of shame tells us they're going to avoid, they're going to withdraw, they're going to attack others, or they're going to attack themselves. And when that manifests in the classroom, it's not a good thing for the kids or for us. And it harms relationships, and it makes it so that kids truly cannot separate out the deed from the doer. So when you bump a kid down on a clip chart, they don't think I just made a bad choice. They think I'm a bad person. So teachers will say to me, well, what if I just have them bump up? Now I've created a clip chart where they're just going to move up. And my beautiful little boy came home from a great day at school, and he said to me, I didn't earn the, thing that was in the bucket that day, whatever, because I didn't do something that was good enough. And I was like, did you have a bad day? It's a good chance you could have made a bad choice at school. So I'm digging in, we actually ended up asking the teachers what happened. He had a great day. He just didn't do enough to get the thing to move up or receive the thing he was supposed to get, or he could get. And I said to him, did you know how you could get it? And he wasn't even clear exactly how he could get it. So I'll tell teachers, just take the whole thing off. And I had somebody, true story, say to me, can I just keep it up on the wall and not use any clips? And I said, why would you do that? And they're like, because then this kids still know. You know, we want to threaten so bad. Then they'll still know it's there. And in my brain, I'm like, if you want something really colorful on the wall, go for zones of regulation. Teach kids what it means to regulate and to be aware of their own emotions and feelings and behaviors. But if your folks still don't understand why this might feel bad, go ahead and put this up in your teacher's lounge. Okay? Just go ahead and put it up in there. Just set it up on the side, and as the year goes, you just kind of put those clips on. Okay? You just grab the names and just put them on. And I'm sure everybody will be just golden about that. Small changes that we make can make a huge impact for our kids.
Hey, Mr. Q.
Did you see that? Why would somebody do that?
Please go into the classroom, no talking, quietly.
Hey, Miss Merida. How you doing?
We need you inside.
How do you think that makes us feel?
I forgot my number.
What's your name?
Jordan?
What's your last name?
Carter?
All right. Go ahead.
School is hard enough.
Come on in, sit down quietly at your desks, and begin writing.
This kind of stuff just makes it harder.
I said quietly, please. Who's talking? Is it you, Sophie? Don't let it be you.
Don't believe me?
Sophie.
Please just watch.
I'm not up here for me, I'm up here for you. Pay attention, okay? Now somebody answer me. Somebody needs to answer me really fast.
Every time we're ignored or yelled at or silenced, a teacher takes away what's possible.
No horseplay, no running, and especially no talking.
Moment by moment.
Miss Garrity, your students' behavior yesterday in the lunchroom, it was terrible. Next time, silent lunch.
Did you hear that? Stay in line and catch a bubble. I'm not playing.
If this is education, we're in trouble.
Bye, Miss McGarrity.
Frederick Douglass said, once you learn to read, you'll be forever free. The way it is now, 2 of the 3 of us will never be able to really read. It doesn't have to be this way.
Hey, Jordan. How you doing?
Good.
Good.
Everyone we meet throughout our day can make a difference.
I've been waiting for you to arrive.
All the difference.
Good, how are you? Great. Hi, Jordan. Bye, Jason.
Good morning, Jordan.
How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for asking. How are you?
Good.
Go ahead and put your number in.
Talk with
I
us,
don't know my number.
not at us.
That's okay. I'll look it up for you. Go ahead, sweetheart.
Okay.
All right. Have a
Teach
good
us what we need to know.
Good morning.
That's how we get smarter.
Well, good morning, Sophie, Janicia, and Jordan.
And when you talk with us and teach us, give us bigger and bigger words.
Now what I'd like you to do, children, is turn around and converse with your neighbor and discuss where the mother might have gone.
Words that we can use to read and understand,
She is prey for eagles, so she hunts at night.
and that will take us places we can never reach without you.
Remember, we're entering the learning zone. Now, how can we show our respect to the children and teachers who are working?
We can walk quietly.
Yes. Okay, kids, so what I'd like you to do is continue writing your narrative, documenting your emotions if you were the baby owl and your mother abandoned you in the nest.
What can you do? Learn all that you can so that you can challenge us to be our best.
You would have stayed and assisted them in whatever they needed.
Share yourself with us and show us how to share ourselves with others. Give us courage. Give us compassion. Help us find our own voices so we can become who we are meant to be.
Why would you want to silence us?
All right, so we can change the environment, right? And then we also can change our language. We can change what we say and how we interact with kids. Research indicates that you can change behavior by 80% just by pointing out specifically what kids are doing right. That is a crazy number for us to not do that. starting yesterday, right? So we call this specific, positive, and corrective feedback. Specific. So people get tripped up on the positive part. Like if I say, great job, good work. But it's the specific part that makes the difference. So think about this. All right, you're a teacher, and you just had a meeting with your administrator. And your administrator says, I observed you in that parent-teacher conference yesterday. And I want you to know it went horrible. It was awful. I'm not going to give you any specific feedback on what went wrong. And I'm not going to give you any specific feedback on what to do to make it better. But if it happens again, there's going to be serious problems. Okay, and then let's take that scenario the other way with specific feedback. So your administrator says, hey, I sat in that parent-teacher meeting with you yesterday. I feel like it didn't really get kicked off on the right foot. Because what I saw was that when you started the meeting, you started with the kids' weaknesses or their needs instead of starting with their strengths. And what that did was it looked like it really disengaged the family. So the next time you start a meeting with a parent or family member, let's start with the strengths of the kid, and let's see if that changes the interaction with the family. It takes the exact same amount of time to do it, but it's actually an intervention, and it increases the likelihood of changing the behavior. Okay? So we call that specific, positive, and corrective feedback. So there's 3 steps to it. It's as simple as that. You name the person so we know exactly who we're talking about. So we would say, Allie, that's the way we start it. And then we point out the specific behavior. It's got to be contingent on the behavior. When the behavior happens, you're going to point it out. And then we connect it back to the school-wide expectations. So that's the example I gave. Allie, thanks so much for getting to class on time, which looks like 2 feet in the door when the bell rings. That's how we be respectful in our classroom. You connect it back to the expectations. That's the last piece that's so critical. Then when kids get into the tier 2 level, right, they just break through into the yellow zone, and we're going to put them into check and check out. All you do is add a morning person who cares about kids, who's pretty much the qualifications to be this person. You care about kids, you engage with kids well, and you smile. And I know that's going to disqualify a couple people from your staff, but I feel confident you can find at least a couple people in the morning who can do that, right? Then they're going to get that specific feedback all throughout the day at really predictable times. And then we're going to give them somebody in the afternoon, again, to say, hey, care about you a ton, can't wait to see you back here tomorrow. Don't forget, we're going to be respectful, responsible, safe. People get so overwhelmed by check in, check out. I can't do that. I don't have time to do that. And oftentimes it's because we haven't been having them do specific feedback at tier 1. It shouldn't be that heavy of a lift to say, since you're already giving specific feedback to all the kids in your classroom, here's 3 kids that need a higher dose of it. That's it. But in so many schools, the first time we're asking folks to give specific feedback around behavior is at that tier 2 place, and they feel like it's a really heavy lift. The Danielson model tells us otherwise. We need to be thinking about it in terms of the behavior side as well, not just the academic side. So once you understand this, you won't be able to say, I don't have time to do check and check out. I don't think check and check out will work for this kid. How can I do it with 5 kids? The student doesn't bring me their tracker, or check and check out isn't working. If you replace that with feedback, you'd be saying, I don't have time to provide feedback. You'd be saying, I don't think providing feedback is going to work for this student. How can I give specific feedback to 5 kids in my class at a higher dose? Well, the student doesn't ask me for specific feedback. So why should I be giving it to them? Like our kids are begging us for Read 180. Like, please, please give me the intervention, right? We owe it to them to just give it to them. And feedback isn't working. Of course it works when it's done right. It's evidence-based. We know it works. And so we're really saying sometimes when we say we don't have time to do it, I can save you that time. Because you would have come over here and gone, how many times have I asked you to do that? When you do that, it sets an example for everybody else. I don't have to keep coming over here. 2 minutes I'm standing here, where I could have just done what I did before, which is half the amount of time, and actually get outcomes from it. So oftentimes with this work, we can save you time and energy, so you're not a hamster on a wheel who's not spitting that much out from it. All right, last thing, we're going to wrap up here. When we know the why, it changes everything, right? So we've talked a little bit about lots of different aspects of this work, some on the what. When you know the why, it changes it all.
This is called How Do I Know? And a lot of times when people hear the phrase, how do I know, the next thing they say is what? How do I know what? But the key really isn't to know what. The key is to know why. Because when you know your why, you have options on what your what can be. For instance, my why is to inspire people to walk in purpose. My what is stand-up comedy. My what is writing books. My what can be going out with some friends to eat. In fact, another what that has moved me towards my why is a web series that we have out now called Break Time. So every Wednesday at 3 o'clock, you should subscribe to the channel. We do a series called Break Time on YouTube. So 3 o'clock, we drop a new episode. One episode in particular, I'm about to show you a clip to. We were in Winston-Salem. So break time, this is how it works. I travel the country, I do stand-up comedy, probably an hour, hour and a half at an event. And in the middle of my show, I'll just sit down and start talking to the audience. And funny just happens. Or I'll meet somebody who's really interesting. So I met this one guy, and he said that he teaches music at a school. I was like, all right, you teach music, can you sing? And then I'm just gonna show you the clip. Check it. So you're a musical director. Cool.
Yes, sir.
All right, so let me get a couple bars of like Amazing Grace. Can you do the first part of that? Go ahead.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
Wow. That bro could sing. You know what I'm saying? All right. Now, what you give me the version is if your uncle just got out of jail, you got shot in the back when you was a kid. I'm just saying, let me see the hood version real quick, if you know which version I'm talking about. Just see if that exists. Let me see what you got.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Right now I'm found, was blind, but now I see.
So here's the thing. The first time I asked him to sing, he knew what he was doing. The second time I asked him to sing, he knew why he was doing it. When you know your why, your what has more impact because you're walking in or towards your purpose.
So this work is not just about checking off things on a list. Sometimes I think we get lost in that, especially in our schools, that we're just going to do this and this and this. You have to know why you're doing it. I challenge you to make sure you know every step of the way. Ask whoever you need to ask. Why are we doing this assessment? Why are you asking us about the kids? Why are you asking us to give specific feedback? Know why you're doing it, and it'll be so much more impactful for our kids. We can make a huge difference. I believe that we can change the story. So let me take you all the way back to the start, the starfish story. I think we can change the end of that story. If we are going to be more than positive, be aware that this work is about more than being positive. There's a lot more to it than that. If we raise our awareness of what's going on for our kids coming into our schools, if we start seeing their barriers, look at our classrooms, see what might be triggering kids. And if we know the why behind the work, I believe that we can change the story. So it could go something like this. Same little girl is throwing something into, she's about to throw something into the water. Man's walking down the beach. He sees this little girl and she's got something in each of her hands. In one hand, she's got a starfish. And in the other hand, she's got a triangle. And he walks over to the girl and he says, "What are you doing?" And she says, I'm throwing back in the water the very last fish. We reached them all. Do you want to throw it with me? And they say, goodbye, Bobby, and they throw him back in the water. I think you can reach all of them, and I think we can do it with purpose and intention behind the things we're doing here and understanding the why. They're counting on you, and I'm hoping that we can get there together. I'm looking forward to this afternoon where I get to spend time with your teams. Thank you so much for everything you do for our kids. Truly, you're making a difference. Thank you. Appreciate it.